I'm sure you've seen a bunch of different tutorials, mine included, that tell you to use boxes for your construction. But you might run into a problem where you draw the boxes, but then you don't know how to make the transition from boxes to the actual body. The main problem is that while every single object can be drawn as a box, when it comes to drawing anything, proportions also come into play. If you decide to directly use a box as the guideline and you draw on top of it, your proportions are going to be completely wrong because the object you're drawing doesn't take up the exact same amount of volume as the box, and that messes up the proportions. Essentially, the box exists to define the three-dimensionality of the object. It's the first step of the construction process, but there are more steps afterwards that you need to use to turn this into an actual drawing. Now, I've already gone over how to draw proper boxes in a previous video, and I highly recommend you watch that video at some point, because for boxes to work in your construction, they need to be near perfect. They don't have to be absolutely perfect, but there is a very small margin for error, which is why, if you're still a beginner, you probably won't be able to use boxes properly because you just don't have the line control skills or the perspective intuition to be able to draw boxes correctly. So the common thing people struggle with when using boxes is they just don't draw them correctly, and then if you draw on top of those incorrect boxes, you end up with incorrect proportions, and the perspective will also be incorrect. So I'm assuming you've watched that previous video, and then from this point on, I'm going to assume that you know how to draw proper boxes. So the first thing we need to talk about is why we even use boxes in the first place. The main reason is because of how three-dimensionality works. The three dimensions are height, width, and depth. These dimensions exist perpendicularly to each other, so we end up with this coordinate system that I'm sure you've seen before. Because these dimensions are perpendicular to each other, the simplest form we can use to represent these dimensions is a box. We have a very clear height, width, and depth, all at 90 degrees to each other. With a box, it's also very easy to tell where the planes are because they're clearly separated, and at most, we can only see 3 planes at the same time. No matter how a box rotates, the maximum number of planes we can see at the same time is always 3. Now, every object exists in these 3 dimensions, meaning every object can be placed inside of a box as long as the box is big enough. And that also means that every object will have to follow the same rules that a box has to follow. So if we ignore the shape of the actual object, because those are just small details, and we think about how it exists in 3D space, every object is made up of 6 planes that are all perpendicular to each other, and at most, we can only see 3 planes at the same time. This is also where the perspective comes in, because perspective basically means that every set of parallel lines that recede into the depth will converge to a vanishing point. A box has 3 sets of parallel lines, so in linear perspective, at most, we can have 3 vanishing points, which is 3-point perspective. If only 2 sets are receding into the depth, it's 2-point perspective, and if only 1 set is receding, it's 1 point. Because every object is basically a box, the general perspective of the whole form will follow the same perspective rules as that of a box. Another thing that proves this idea that everything is basically a box is lighting. When light interacts with a box, it illuminates the planes differently. The plane that's most perpendicular to the light source will be the brightest, and the ones that are facing away will be the darkest. Any object being illuminated by a single light source works the same way. Even if it's a very complicated form, the plane that's facing the light source will be the brightest, and the plane that's facing away the darkest. That's essentially why boxes are so important and why people always talk about it. They're just really integral to how 3D space works. Before we continue, this video is sponsored by Skillshare. Now, I've been trying to work a bit on my perspective skills recently, so I was looking for resources to help with that practice, and I came across Scott Harris's perspective class on Skillshare. Now, this class covers like a lot of the basic perspective fundamentals that we've all seen 100 times before, but he also goes over some of the more advanced topics, such as different camera angles and also how composition works in backgrounds. So I practiced the things he was talking about, and kind of unexpectedly, I think it actually did make me a little bit better at understanding perspective. Now, outside of Scott's class, Brent Eviston also has some very useful classes that I've talked about in previous videos as well. He's got a class that covers how to draw in 3 dimensions, he has a class that covers figure drawing, and also one that covers observation. If these are fundamentals that you're trying to learn, I do highly recommend checking out these classes. Skillshare has a bunch of other classes as well, covering basically any topic you can think of, and all of these classes are taught by industry professionals. The art and illustration category in particular probably has one of the largest selections of classes on the whole platform. There are classes on watercolor, calligraphy, fashion design, and pretty much any skill that you would need as an artist. So, if you want to improve as an artist in any of these categories, I'd highly recommend checking out Skillshare. The first 500 people to use my link in the description or scan the QR code will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So now that we know why boxes are important, we need to talk about how to use them as guidelines. The main thing to remember is that the purpose of these boxes is not so that we can use them as a replacement for the form and then draw everything else around it. We need to use these boxes to help us define how this object exists in 3D space, like how it's rotated, how it's tilted, and how it's foreshortened. This is all kind of self-explanatory, and if you play around with boxes for a little bit and you fill up a couple pages of just boxes, eventually you do get the hang of how to rotate them, how to tilt them, and how to change the foreshortening on them. The only real issue are the proportions. Now let's say we're trying to draw the ribcage, for example. The ribcage needs to have very specific proportions for it to make the body look okay, because if you make it too small, it looks wrong. If you make it too big, it looks wrong. So let's say we draw a box that's this small. It does tell us how the ribcage exists in space, but then when it comes to drawing the actual ribcage guidelines, we need to make them bigger than the box that we've already drawn, and then the guidelines fall outside of the perspective that we already determined. So now we have to make adjustments, and then everything goes wrong. It's really important that we get the proportions more or less correct for the object that we're trying to draw. So ideally, you want to get good enough to be able to draw the box in the correct orientation with proportions that support the object we're trying to draw. This is why people also recommend drawing a ton of boxes separately, because that's essentially what trains your intuition to guess box proportions. One thing that makes the body in particular really hard to simplify to boxes is that the head, ribcage, and pelvis are 3 separate forms and need to be drawn as 3 separate boxes. So, not only do you have to think about the orientation and proportions of each box individually, but you also need to think about what they look like and where they are in relation to each other. On top of that, another thing that makes using boxes difficult is that you also need to figure out how the object fits inside of the box. It's extremely rare for an object to perfectly touch the edges of the box. Usually, it'll be an irregularly shaped object that basically touches random parts of the box. The ribcage, for example, fits inside of a box like this. We can see that the top and bottom of the ribcage touch the box at different points. So let's say we're trying to do kind of a tracing exercise and we're drawing on top of an image. We can't match the box to the body perfectly because these points don't line up with the edges of a proper box. This is also a pretty common mistake that artists make when they try to draw the body as boxes, because when they're drawing the upper torso box, they try to align the bottom corners of the box to the bottom corners of the 10th rib, or basically the bottom corners of the rib cage, and they try to align the top corners of the box to the collarbones. The problem is that all of these points exist at different points in space and none of them align with each other. So if you forcibly try to align them and you try to draw a box following these points, the box isn't going to turn out correctly. The best thing you can do in this scenario is find 2 points on the object and use those to anchor how the object is tilted. With the pelvis, for example, we can use the anterior superior iliac spines, which are these 2 points at the front. We can draw a box following these 2 points, and then of course the rest of the pelvis won't really fit inside of the box, but at least we get the perspective right. So now let's do an attempt where we try to draw the box, that's a perfect circle, where we try to identify the box guidelines and then draw the actual form guidelines. So like I already said, the head, rib cage, pelvis are 3 separate forms, so we need 3 separate boxes. First, the head. This shouldn't be that difficult because the head can be very clearly divided into a front plane, side plane, and then back plane, top plane. And that division happens right here at the cheekbones and technically the temporal line as well, which is right above the eyebrows, but the cheekbones are probably the best landmark to use for this. And then the perspective is decided by how the eyebrows, the eyes, bottom of the nose, the mouth, and how the chin are tilted. So we can see that these are all going this way, meaning there's a vanishing point over there. But you don't really have to think about the vanishing points when drawing the head because it can make it look a little bit weird. So the top edge of the box would be somewhere around here, I want to say. It's slightly above the hairline, which in this case is right around there. Because if you were to look at the head from side view, if we say the hairline is over here, the top of the head extends a little bit above that. And if we want to put this inside of a box, or I guess simplify it to a box, we need to make sure that that top edge is a little bit above that hairline. So I think it would be right over there. Then it is kind of difficult to place that edge on the other side, but I think it'd be right there. Well, actually, I think I'd probably have to make it there. It's hard to keep this stuff symmetrical. That's kind of the issue. And then from here, we can see that from the cheekbones to the ear, there's an angle like that, meaning the perspective of this bottom part is actually supposed to be going up like that. And then I think this one would have to very slightly be angled upwards because we can still see the top plane a little bit. And then I guess we'll do it like that. Now moving on to the torso, this is kind of a difficult pose because of how the torso is angled, but I guess we'll start with the pelvis because it's a bit easier to see. We can see the aces points right here, and those establish the perspective, or I guess the tilt or rotation that the pelvis has, and in this case, it's going this way, I think. Yeah, that looks about right. So then the verticals, or actually, I think proportion-wise, it's probably better to place these points a bit higher than the actual aces points because the pelvis is pretty short. So we'll end up with a very short box, which won't really help us guideline-wise. And then once we have the verticals established, it's pretty easy to place the lines going into the depth because if you have the front plane of a box, like let's say there's a line going this way to a vanishing point, and then we have the entire front plane established, there's only one correct orientation for the lines going into the depth. If you've actually studied the rules for boxes, these lines cannot go this way, for example, because that's not a proper box. So there's only one direction that these lines receding into the depth can go to. Now for the ribcage box, this one is really difficult to draw just in general because unlike the pelvis where the aces points are the anchor that you can use for the front corners of the box, usually we use the bottom corners of the rib cage as the anchors for the bottom edge of the box. But the problem is that the bottom corners of the rib cage are not at the edges of the rib cage. The bottom corners of the rib cage are right here and right here, and we can see that the edges of the rib cage still extend past those points. So then right here, there's an angle that goes inwards. Then all the different forms of the rib cage can actually twist. The rib cage is a pretty flexible form, unlike the pelvis, which is just a solid form. So it's always going to be following the same perspective as that of the box. The rib cage twists, so the perspective can get pretty weird. And then on top of that, the shoulders can also move separately, making the perspective even weirder. But in this case, we can see that there's a slight bend in the torso there, and there's a stretch there, meaning that the rib cage should be angled somewhat like this, I think. And then I think it is twisted. One of the corners is here, one of the other corners is over here somewhere. and then the pit of the neck is right there. So I think it is slightly twisted in this particular area. To draw the box, this one's going to be pretty difficult. I think the bottom edge is angled this way, so going to a vanishing point over there, meaning the top edge is going to be angled the same way, or well, going to the same vanishing point. Then, like I said, the verticals are angled kind of this way, and we can see a lot more of the side plane here at the bottom than we can see at the top, but I think I'll, which means that it's twisted, but I think I'll just keep the box like this, and then we'll do that. You can see a very small part of the top plane, or a very small part of the bottom plane, I mean, and then let me also draw through the forms, just to check if everything is done kind of correctly, which the ribcage box isn't. I can already tell the perspective on it looks weird. Now that we have the boxes, we can just draw, or we can use these boxes to draw our actual guidelines. And you don't have to draw inside of the boxes, technically. You can go outside of them, but like I mentioned in the actual video, if you go outside of the boxes, it means that your boxes were not proportioned correctly, meaning the perspective is going to have to be reconsidered when you're drawing your actual forms. And that might be one of the issues that you're having if you've ever struggled with using boxes. You're not proportioning your boxes correctly, and then because of that, you have to constantly redo those proportions whenever you're drawing your actual guidelines, and that constantly throws your perspective, it constantly makes your perspective look weird, and you have to redo it the entire time. But I think that's basically it. I think the pelvis box is a little too big, as well as what I did with the proportions there, so just make those a bit smaller in the future. But I guess that's basically how you would have to consider using boxes. And that's it for the video, so if that was helpful, leave a like on the video, leave a comment, let me know what you want to see next. If you want to join our Discord server, there's a link in the description, and you can also join YouTube memberships if you want to support the channel. But that does it for me, so I guess I'll catch you all next time.